Good morning, how's everybody?
Good morning.
Well, we're getting close to class time on Bandle time. I imagine we'll still have a few people straggle in, but we could probably start chatting and just invite them into the conversation. So we're doing ethics today. And ethics more broadly fits into what philosophers talk about as the philosophy of value, which includes aesthetics like beauty, how do we value art, and politics. And so whereas like politics is how do we determine the right thing together, ethics tends to be a little more individualistic, like what's right for me to do. So we're probably going to focus a lot today on like what is the right action for me to do. But I started with a broader quote because ethics really does have to do with like the idea of what's the good life, what is happiness, how do I do the right things overall to lead a good life. And so Aristotle said, happiness lies in virtuous activity, and perfect happiness lies in the best activity, which is contemplative. So spoken like a true philosopher, he thought the greatest happiness was to do what he did, which was to think hard about things all day. But I like the idea that, what is a good life, right? And what is happiness, and grounding that in some way in virtue. A lot of times when we think about happiness or the good life, especially if we talk about Epicureanism or other things, we tend to simplify it down to the idea of pleasures. But here he's tying happiness to this broader idea of virtue, not just pleasure, which will relate to at least one of the ethical systems we look at today. So actually, before I get into it, because I lay out kind of three big branches of ethics, I thought we would start with just thought experiments. So the way philosophers usually do philosophy is with thought experiments, where scientists run real-life experiments on things and you can observe the outcomes. Philosophers put out an idea and play with it and say, what does this imply? And so with ethics, you've probably all heard many of the famous ones, right? Is it okay to steal a loaf of bread if you're dying of hunger or your family is? Is it okay to lie to a Nazi if you're hiding Jews in your attic? I don't know if you've done all the trolley problems. Trolley problems can be fun. Maybe we'll get to that today. I tried to think of one that was a little more modern. It's still probably not super realistic to most people in the room, but the thing about philosophical thought experiments is they don't necessarily have to be realistic because they're just pushing at like, why do you think that? Like, what's the underlying reason? Even if you'll never face this situation in your life, why do you think what you think? And so the one I thought we would play with first is the idea of medical ethics and transplants and things like that. And so let's say that you're a surgeon, and on your table is a random patient came in for a routine surgery, but it just so happens that his blood type and everything happens to match perfectly with 5 other patients in your hospital that are likely to die very soon if they don't get an organ transplant. One of them needs a heart, one of them needs a kidney, one of them needs a liver. If you just happen to nick this guy's aorta, you could take his 5 organs and give them to 5 different people, and 5 lives would be saved for one. So is that okay? Would you do that?
That's why you don't sign the card on the back of your license.
You look, yeah, his driver's license says he's an organ donor.
Jason, you started with the easy stuff this morning.
I am. Yeah, you got to start easy and then you complicate it. So I'm guessing you wouldn't. Any care to elaborate?
Was that where the idea of first do no harm comes into play?
Mm-hmm.
Because of things like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so doctors all take an oath, first do no harm. All right, and so that'll get into something we'll talk about of like, is there an order or a priority to ethical rules? If we have more than one thing that we think is good, how do we adjudicate between them? Does one come first? First, do no harm. So I'm guessing most of you are thinking no, right? I saw a couple head shakes.
Unless you go by the Star Trek philosophy, which is the good of the many outweighs the needs of the few.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the 3 major branches of philosophy is pretty much that. That's what I was trying to get at, right? 5 lives is more than one, right? Like, isn't it right to help 5 people if you're only harming 1 person? But we all think no. Like, that does feel easy, right? Like, we're not going to kill someone. Yeah.
What if he's a murderer?
Yeah, all right, so let's complicate it. So I've assumed everybody's kind of average good, right? Random patient, 5 other random patients. What if the reason he's in the hospital is not a routine surgery, but he was a drunk driver that just caused a wreck? And the person that he hit is dead. So he did kill someone, right? So you've got this drunk driver on the table, but you know you can save his life. Like, his injuries aren't that bad. If he gets through the surgery, he's going to be okay. But if you botch the surgery a little bit, the drunk driver saves 5 other people with his organs.
Or does he?
Does that change it?
Or does he?
Or does he? Because
Okay.
what damage was, how much has he drank? How much?
Well, none of them need the liver, all right? Heart, I don't know what else you can transplant that's life-saving that wouldn't be, yeah. He's got a good heart at least, I don't know. Does that change it at all to anybody, do you think? If he's a murderer, if he just committed a crime? What if one of the people that needs an organ transplant is the person he hit? So he didn't actually kill, maybe multiple people in the car, maybe one died, I don't know. But let's say there's at least one victim left alive. They need a heart. His heart is still good. You could save 5 people, and one of those people is his victim. Does that change anything? I'm still sensing no's, but I'm getting a little more deliberation, maybe. Okay, so I'm going to do at least one more thing. This is how the trolley problems usually progress. You try to, toy with your action a little bit too. So let's pretend now you're not the main surgeon, you're the assisting surgeon. And the main surgeon makes a mistake, genuine mistake. He's not trying to kill the guy, but he doesn't notice. And he goes to start to sew up, and you know, if I don't say anything, this guy's going to die. But I could say something. I could say, oh, look, you just nicked the aorta, you didn't see it, but don't sew up yet, let's save this guy. If you just keep quiet, 5 people get their organs today. Would you keep quiet?
But there's always consequences to stuff like that.
Yeah. Like?
Autopsy.
Okay. So it could get discovered. I'm assuming you don't get discovered, but we never know that for sure. Yeah. You're making this decision, and the head surgeon could be the one blamed if the autopsy shows the mistake, right? Oh, he did it.
Yeah.
But you could have prevented that.
I guess I go back to Genesis. We're made in God's image,
Yeah.
and everybody's important. I realize choices have to be made.
Yeah.
But why are we deliberately checking somebody's life?
Yeah. That's good. Any other thoughts on? Do you feel different about action versus inaction? So in my first scenario, you are killing him. In my second scenario, you're doing nothing, but you know that your silence will result in his death. Is that different? Okay, I'll let you think about it. So we're gonna, I think about 3 big things today. I try not to overuse philosophy words you're never going to use again, and I know at least deontology is probably one of those, but I'm sorry, it's what everybody in the industry calls it. I'll call it deontology. Deontology is probably what we're actually the most familiar with, even though we wouldn't use the word deontology. It's the idea that there are moral laws, and things are just right and wrong. You don't take a life, right? So deontology tends to hang mostly on the idea of duty. What is my moral duty in this situation? And it tends to define those with laws or rules. And so if you think about the idea of do the ends ever justify the means, deontology is very focused on the means, the action, what you do. And so deontology would generally say no, the ends don't justify the means, it's the means that are important. It's what you do, it's the rule, it's the law, it's your duty. So deontology is centered around obligation and articulating what are these kind of universal moral principles that rationality can show us, or other, we'll talk about divine command theory, maybe just God gave the rules, but whatever they're grounded in, we just know the rules, our duty is to obey the rules, that's what makes it right and wrong. The second is utilitarianism, And so it focuses more on the idea of we need to think about people's welfare. What's the impact of what we do? The words we use here are really important, and I debated whether to bring up pleasure and pain or not, because I think when we frame it in terms of pleasure, we're less likely to think that's a compelling moral argument, but that is how a lot of utilitarians have talked about it in the past. But really, it doesn't have to be just what we think about as pleasure. And if you go back to how Aristotle defined pleasure as, a good life, a virtuous activity, I don't just mean like physical pleasure here, but we could call it human flourishing. We could call it shalom. We could call it, welfare is already up there. But essentially, good things for people, right, versus suffering or pain. And so for whatever we do, we have to think about the consequences of our action. Does it harm people or does it help people? Does it create more welfare, more shalom, more flourishing, or does it create more pain, more suffering? And that's what matters, okay? And so in this one, then, they're more focused on the ends. If what I do results in better outcomes for people, it's the right thing to do. If what I do results in harm to people, it's the wrong thing to do. And so that's sort of the fundamental idea of utilitarianism. It's called that because when they're trying to measure like welfare, it was a util. It was like the utility of it, right? So you think about the utility of your actions, what's the value of the outcome, and so it's utilitarianism. Virtue is a sort of, I struggled for the right words to put in here, but it's essentially like character. And it has a lot to do with how habit develops character. So what determines if something is right or wrong is whether it is courageous, prudent, wise, these virtues. We can define a good virtue. And what a wise, prudent, courageous person would do is the right thing to do. So it's virtues determine right and wrong. So those are the three kind of big branches. Our duty is to follow the rules. Our obligation is to think about the outcomes of causing harm and flourishing. Or we need to just focus on building character virtues, and the virtues determine right and wrong. So any initial thoughts? We started with the thought experiment about whether it's ever okay to let one patient die to save more than one. Now that I've kind of laid out some different big branches of thinking about ethics, any thoughts about these three? All right, let's dive into some details on them. So, Immanuel Kant, super famous philosopher, he was one of the biggest, along with like René Descartes, in creating this Enlightenment era of hyper-rationality. He thought reason was everything. We just need to use logic to rationally arrive at our conclusions, and extremely rationalistic kind of guy, professor in Germany, and loved huge student lecture halls and all that kind of thing. And so his ethics was deontology. It was rational rules. And his biggest kind of principle is this quote. He said, act only according to that maxim. So a maxim is like a rule, right? A proverb, a principle. Act only according to that rule, that maxim, whereby you can at the same time wish, you can wish that it should become a universal law. So, is it okay to kill a patient on the table to save 5 others who need organ transplants? Can you wish that we lived in a society where surgeons always did that? Where that was the universal maxim? Probably not. So Kant would say, therefore, no one can ever do it. That's how reason works. If you can't wish, this was the law of nature, right? He thought of ethics like laws of nature, right? Gravity always applies. So if we can arrive at ethical rules rationally, they must also always apply. So if I cannot wish that surgeons always killed patients when they thought it would bring a better outcome, then no surgeon can ever kill a patient, no matter how good the outcome they think it could be. Because it's a law of nature. Reason dictates surgeons don't kill patients. Universal. Where this gets trickier is things that we really want to care about the outcomes, right? So you're hiding that Jewish family in your attic. The Nazi knocks on the door, and he says, "Are there any Jews here?" Kant, I mean, thankfully for him, he was pre-Nazis, you know, but he would have said, "You got to tell the truth. You cannot lie ever, because we cannot wish to live in a society where people lie whenever they want. If it cannot be a universal principle that you can lie, no one can ever lie." So a Nazi asks you, "Are there Jews here?" And you say, "I was hoping to hide them, but you got me." "Yeah, they're upstairs." Serial killer breaks into a school. He asks, "Tell me where your teacher is." Can't lie. Right? I mean, are we willing to go that far on our moral rules, no matter what the outcome is? Absolutely universal. What do you think? Would you lie to the Nazi? Let me ask it that way.
I've got a question regarding that, sir. And whenever it comes to a situation and that circumstances with morals, ethics, and standards for each individual person, where's the bar that you set for that, and how do you apply it appropriately is my question, because I'm pondering on the question that you delivered, and it's a really good question. Because we're seeking righteousness, and I acknowledge that by all means, because in Jeremiah 29:13 it says, "When you seek me, to seek me wholeheartedly, and you will find me."
Yeah.
So he wants all of us. And in that situation, all of you, how do you deliver?
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Yeah. I don't know that I have a simple answer for you. I mean, I hope throughout the whole class today we might inch towards a conclusion on that. Yeah.
That you caught my attention. You have my undivided attention.
Oh no, that's too much pressure. Yeah.
Well, if we go back to like when Jesus was on earth, and the Pharisees had taken their rules a little bit too far. So he said he came to save the law, not abolish it. Yet he said you can't use the law sometimes to its literalness or legalism, or just to bend to your own gains. So like the rule is there on earth because we're in a fallen society, and what is it trying to help us do for the goodness of humanity? I don't know.
Yeah, you started sounding a little bit like a utilitarian there.
I know.
Yeah, the goodness of humanity. Yeah, we're gonna maximize
yeah,
the greater good.
I acknowledge what you're saying, ma'am, and I think as human beings, I mean, most of us, I believe we're all netted differently. There are some that want to specialize in humanity, and I think that's very important as a body, you know. So we need different branches, like you were just discussing prior to this slide being changed. There's different branches, and I acknowledge that, respectfully speaking. And it's very important, though, because if we didn't have like-minded individuals and people to speak out like you and I mean, how can you ponder on these different thoughts? Because I'm still stuck on you. Like, how? How do I do in this situation?
Yeah. Marty?
It may be rationalization, but I would probably consider what the maxim was. Is my maxim lying, or is my maxim saving lives?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so two things there. One that I think has always been, and this may just be my deficiency in understanding Kant. Kant is very hard to understand. I don't know how broadly universal he expects people to make. So like, if the question is, if a Nazi knocks on my door, can I lie? Do I have to universalize it to every time my lie would save a life, I want people to lie? Because that one I might be able to universalize. I'm okay with that. Or do I have to universalize it to every time I think it could be beneficial, it's okay to lie? Because that one's harder to universalize. I don't want to live in a society where everybody lies every time they think it might be okay to lie, right? Like, how universal does Kant think we have to get? But the other one that I think you were pushing at, which is where I wanted to go, is what if there are competing maxims, right? Like, what if the first rule is do no harm, and I think this is going to harm the Jewish family in the attic. And a secondary rule is never lie. Kant wants everything to be absolute and universal. But what if the unstoppable force hits the unmovable object, right? Like what if two maxims are incompatible? How do you pick? So I tried to find some good biblical examples of that. I struggled a little bit. I found one that y'all may not think is that compelling, but Deuteronomy 22:4, you shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help to lift them up again. So here's one rule. God gives us this rule. You see your neighbor's ox fallen down, you gotta help. All right, here's another rule. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. So when Jaron and I were in Israel, we saw a cistern where they would hold fresh water under a village. And they're pretty big, pretty deep. If an ox falls into a cistern, it ain't easy getting it out. That feels like work to me, all right? So if my neighbor's ox falls into the cistern on the Sabbath, do I work hard to get that ox out on the Sabbath or not? I'm not sure Jesus addressed that quite exactly, but there's one that seems real close. They get mad at him for healing on the Sabbath. And he says, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? So I don't know for sure if he was thinking about the tension between these two exactly. Because we can always debate, like, was healing on the Sabbath ever illegal? Like, was he actually breaking a law or not? Maybe not. But he seemed to be saying, well, look, if your ox got injured on the Sabbath, you do something about it. If those two conflict, how do we decide? Right? How do we pick when two laws overlap? Deontology usually doesn't give us a reason. There are some deontologists that just try to rank them, but the fundamental idea of deontology is the rules are the rules. It's a universal absolute. Reason gave us these rules, or God gave us these rules. They're just rules. There's not really an underlying principle by which we can use our own values to rank them. There's another one I couldn't figure out exactly, but the Sabbath is every seven days. Some of the annual Jewish festivals, I think, move around based on how 7-day periods work. So I've heard before that sometimes like a high festival falls on the Sabbath, or like the day before when you might be cooking the meal for it is the Sabbath. What do? Do you honor Yom Kippur, or do you honor the Sabbath? Because you're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath, but you got to do work to honor Yom Kippur, right? So like, what do you do when the laws overlap? So that's one challenge with deontology.
Jason, not thinking about it philosophically, just as a Christian woman, when I'm trying to decide if I should lie about something, because I do lie about something, and I've always applied the thought that if it's for a greater good, I have, and I probably still do lie, but at a certain point, I do ask God to forgive me, because there's a point that I don't understand all that it entails, and I'm making what I think is my best decision. So please forgive me for lying about this, because in my point of view as a human being trying to do good, I felt it was going to do good for these people or this person if I did lie. And so please forgive me if I did sin. But I just was at a point where I was ambivalent about what to do. I just chose what I thought was the better part. That's how, it's not philosophical, but that's how I do it as a...
Yeah, no, that's a good consideration, because I think we have to wonder, like, is there always a perfectly right path? Or do we legitimately have to pick kind of the lesser of evils sort of thing sometimes? And Randy Harris, I remember him at ACU calling it sort of the tragedy of the human fallen predicament, that sometimes we get into a situation where there just is no right outcome. Now, I wrestled with that because, of course, we think Jesus lived a sinless life. And so he always found the right thing to do. So is it that we only get into situations where there is no right thing to do because of prior sin? right? So like, I promised Garrett I'm going to go to his basketball game. I promised my other son I'm going to take him to his Christian rap concert. They happen to be at the same time. Like, I've got to break a promise. Breaking a promise is wrong, but I've got to break a promise. Well, maybe the original sin was I shouldn't have made two promises that could contradict, right? Like, that was my misstep. Now that I've done something wrong, I've got to do something else wrong. Yeah, okay. So let's look at, if deontology sometimes makes it hard to pick between rules, one possible path is utilitarianism. So Jeremy Bentham said, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So again, I said we might not love the word happiness, but if we replace it with welfare, human flourishing, shalom, we get closer to something we can feel a little better about. The idea is it our obligation to try to create the best outcomes for the world at large and the least pain and suffering? And is that how we decide whether it's okay to lie or not in a certain situation, right? Whether it's okay to let that drunk driver die that we might have been able to save because his organ will go to save the person he hit, right? Like, how do we think through that?
But every one of these cases, once you add another element, another human being, now you have to deal with, well, do they want to be saved? Do they want us to step in, even if it means lying? Maybe they don't want that. Maybe they want what they're doing, and we're trying to change them, and they don't want that. That's not a good explanation, but that's sort of the idea.
Yeah. Humans are complicated. Did I see a hand over here?
Yeah, he answered exactly what I was heading in that direction, but I second that.
One of the hardest things about this is because the original utilitarians, it's hard to know what was truly in their heads, but they seem to almost think we could actually do the calculus. Like, we can calculate what's going to create the greatest happiness, the greatest pain, and figure it out. And if you take that to its logical extreme, it's really hard. I mean, if you could have killed Hitler when he was a toddler, the world would have been a better place.
Yeah.
We can never know that, right? Nobody could have known that at the time. But how do we know other people's wishes, desires, priorities? How do we know the consequences of our actions and the unintended consequences that ripple out from that? The idea that we can figure out how much pain and happiness our actions are going to cause is usually a pipe dream, a fairy tale, right? Like, we usually just can't.
But then it seems like you're making decisions based on fear, too. Like, because if the flip side of the coin is, like, you have to make your decision based on the greatest, like, the happiness, then aren't you always fearful of what could disrupt that happiness? And then you might be making your decisions more out of fear.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a good one, man. That's something to ponder on. I just wanna. That gives you a good. That's a great question, because I mean, on both sides of the spectrum, I mean, you know, you gotta kind of weigh it out, because I believe justice, the symbol of justice, is that kind of balance and weighing
scale.
thing. You know what I'm talking about. So yeah.
Good.
Well, when you think of that, I mean, how many times does the Bible say, do not fear? So if we walk in fear, you know, that's obviously not what God wants for us.
And that brings in another aspect, God. If you think, if Herod only died a few days earlier, then the babies wouldn't have died, and Jesus and Mary and Joseph wouldn't have to flee to Egypt. If only, you know. But then you get over, if Judas hadn't betrayed Jesus, you get all these ifs, and it throws in. But we see a greater purpose, but we don't have that knowledge to see the totality of that purpose.
I always think of the parable of the lost sheep. I just don't see the Bible as very utilitarian at all. Because if the shepherd was utilitarian, he would have said, well, I still have 99 sheep, who cares about the one lost? Majority over minority always.
Yeah, that's good.
It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. That's really good. Most Christians don't like this one. Actually, the very first utilitarians were Christian, and then it took this hard branch, and like most utilitarians since then have been secular or atheists, and Christians have been really negative about utilitarianism. When I was in my ethics class at ACU, Randy Harris asked, does anybody want to make an argument that the Bible is utilitarian or God is utilitarian? And nobody raised their hand. But I kind of regret not raising my hand, not because I think it is, but just because I think it's like there are a couple interesting little arguments you could try to make, and I regret silence. Like I think it's healthy to have the debate, right? So yeah, you're right. I mean, the Bible certainly does not seem utilitarian. There are a couple things I want to push at and see if you think I create any wedge in there or not. Okay, so the first one is essentially just the golden rule. Matthew 7:12, Jesus says, "So in everything, do unto others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." So what I think is interesting about that is, how do you decide what's right and wrong? How do you decide what to do to somebody? Well, what you would want them to do to you is usually to enhance your welfare, your flourishing, your shalom, to minimize your pain and your suffering. We don't normally want people to do things to us that cause unjustified suffering. And Jesus seems to imply here that us thinking about what to do to people based on what we would want them to do to us is the principle behind all of the laws. I mean, think about that statement. This sums up the law and the prophets. So deontology says the rules are the rules. God said, don't wear a piece of clothing woven of two different fabrics. I have no idea why, but that's just the rule, right? Don't eat of that tree in the center of the garden. I don't know why, it's just the rule. Jesus is saying all of the rules can be summed up in a principle. If you think about doing unto others what you want them to do unto you, that's the law. That's interesting, right? Like, why? Why is that the law? I think it implies there is some principle behind all of the different little rules that is a logical coherent of kind of like why those are the rules.
Is it
What do you
fair
think?
to say that the laws are a form of simplicity, and us as human beings kind of can't comprehend the simplicity?
Maybe. So I don't know for sure exactly what you mean by that, but I hear some things in it that I like. One that I thought about putting in here that I didn't is they're talking about divorce, and they say, well, why then did Moses say to give a certificate of divorce? And Jesus says, well, essentially, your hearts were too hard, and God would have rather said, don't ever get divorced, but this was what Moses could do for you, basically. Like, this is what God... And I kind of think, like, he needed to give them a simple rule, and they weren't quite ready yet for no divorce, and so he said, I'm going to regulate it. Like, you can't just throw a woman out. You got to have a process. You got to have a certificate. We're going to, like, put some rules around this. Or if you're implying, like, underneath the complicated rules, there's a more simple principle. Like, that's interesting, too. But, yeah, I don't know.
You look at Joseph, David pointed out this last week, Joseph wanted to put Mary away privately or quietly. Yeah. And when he said that, it sort of fits into what is being said here in Matthew 7. You want to do everything the way you would want to be treated.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a righteous aspect in that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. All right, let's look at one more. This one's a little longer, but on one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? He answered, have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. There's a lot going into that, and we don't have time to go where you probably all want to take it. What is most interesting to me is the idea that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. If you take some really strict deontological perspectives, the rules are first, and our duty is just to obey the rules. Jesus seems to be saying, at least about this one rule, the Sabbath isn't what's supreme. We weren't made to obey the Sabbath. In some sense, for some reason, the rule of the Sabbath was made for us. And I think that for us can have a kind of utilitarian ring to it. Like, God knew this would create flourishing and welfare and good things and not pain and suffering. And so he did it for your good. So, I'm not trying to convince you that God is a utilitarian, because I do still think there are fundamental principles like we don't take an innocent life, right? The surgeon should not kill the patient just to try to donate his organ to others. I don't think utilitarian justifies just anything. I think there are fundamental principles. We're made in the image of God, human dignity. There are things you don't do. But I'm intrigued by the idea that for a lot of what we should and shouldn't do, there is this principle of, are we doing things that create good, right? Like, are we creating flourishing and not suffering? And so I don't know how to resolve the mix of those. But I think utilitarian can at least be helpful in thinking through, right? Like, there's a single mother at our church. If I say I can do something that brings her joy and welfare, is your initial gut reaction that's probably a good thing to consider or not? If I say I can do something that brings her pain and suffering, is your initial gut reaction to think that sounds good or not, right? Like, we just think we're called to serve the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, we're supposed to do good for people. And utilitarianism, it's not perfect. I don't buy it quite, but it gets at something about this idea that we're called to do good for the least of these, right? We're called to create good and not evil. All right, we got this next one's important, so I want to keep us moving. Is virtue. So my first quote from Aristotle is, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit." So I really love that framing. And Garrett has studied this a lot, so I'm going to let him do most of this section. Let me know when you want to see the table. I don't know if you want to talk here first before you want to go to the table.
Yeah, may I write that real quick, please?
Yeah.
So basically, when we're trying to understand philosophical ideas, it's always best to go back to the ancient Greek philosophers. And looking at Aristotle and Plato, they had two different ideas of how basically the mind and the body work with respect to virtue. And so Aristotle's idea is that virtue is a mean of something. It's the middle. It's the perfect balance of things. So there's a deficiency and an excess. So if you take anger, for example, you could have an excess of anger, like a quick temper, or you could have a lack of anger, which is a lack of spirit, or you could have the perfect balance of anger, which Aristotle calls virtue, the patience or good temper. And Aristotle says, for every category of thing there's a deficiency, a mean, and an excess. And the way to become basically the best person is to achieve the mean in everything. And the way he says to do that is through habit. So through your action. So there's three kind of parts of your body philosophically, of your soul, that you have to think about whenever it comes to this virtue. There's your thoughts, like your mind. There's your soul, or your inner being, and then there's the actions you make. And so the argument is kind of how these things interact and in what order they come to change these virtues. So before Aristotle, Plato was first, and he thought that the mind and the soul and the action are all interlined or interconnected. So if I were to do something action-wise, the other two, my mind and my soul, would have to match that. So if I punch somebody out of anger, it would mean that naturally my mind and my soul are in the excess of anger. But Aristotle says your mind can be out of sync with your habits. You can do something that you don't actually fully believe in. If you take someone who is addicted to eating, and you think about the framework that Aristotle and Plato, how you would see this problem, Plato would look at someone who's addicted to eating and say, just think hard enough about how eating is bad, and then you'll solve your issue. Because the problem with you is that in your mind, in your soul, you feel like you love eating. And so your actions will always match the eating. You are addicted to eating, so you continue to eat. That means your soul and your mind are telling you to eat. So Plato would say, fix your mind and your soul first, and your actions will correspond later. But what Aristotle says is, you can't just think hard enough about an addiction to fix it. That's just not the reality of how addictions work. Like Aristotle said, there can be a disconnect between your action and your true belief. You can still truly believe eating is bad for you, but overeat. Those two things can happen at the same time. And so what Aristotle says is you must formulate the action first to therefore change your inner being. You can try to start the habit of controlling your eating, the habit of thinking about the calories and so on, these things that will impact your reality before you can actually fix your addiction. And so when it comes to that, he would say that your action helps you to overcome your thoughts and put your thoughts into the mean, whereas Plato would say you must first think of and understand the mean so that your actions can follow the virtue. And so I think Aristotle's is probably better and more realistic, because you can't just think about everything enough until you become that thing. You have to put the action into your lives first and actually act out what you think you should do before you can become that thing. And so Aristotle says, in all your life, act as if you were the mean, so that eventually you can become the mean, and it will become just natural to do that thing. And that's how you become the best version of yourself, or the best, or you can live the happiest life, is once you've established these habits to become this mean version of yourself in the virtue.
Any initial questions, comments? What do you think about Aristotle's virtues?
Very good explanation. I actually was in tune with the whole conversation, and I think it's a lot simpler on this side, for sure.
I think that was a dig.
Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I like this a lot because, if I decide in January to clean up my eating, and then there's a big piece of chocolate cake on a plate, and I eat it, Plato would say, in your mind, you truly believe that eating that was the best course of action. You believe that was the right thing to do. Even though you say you want to be healthy, you want to feel good, you actually don't. You really believe the right thing to do is to eat the cake. And Aristotle and others would say, no, you can genuinely believe your life would be better off not doing that, but still do it because we have vices and we have bad habits. And what you have to do is practice and have discipline and develop through habit virtues that lead you to actually do what you know is the right thing to do. And that just seems more realistic to how we do good, right? So Jaren and I, one of our good friends in college was Kent Brantley. Kent grew up to be a doctor, and you may remember the story of the Ebola outbreak in Africa. He was the doctor that got Ebola in Africa and ended up getting flown back to the US. And while he was in Africa, he and his assistant, I think she was a nurse, both got Ebola. And there was this experimental new drug. This sounds like a movie. This is a movie plot, but it was real. There was this experimental new drug, and they had one dose of it over there, one treatment. And he decided to split it with her. And we had no idea whether half of a dose would be effective or not. But he didn't want to take it alone. And Jonathan Stormont wrote an article that said you cannot think of what Kent Brantley did as making a decision that day. It was a life of practice, a full 30 years of living to try to become more like Jesus that led to what he did. He didn't just rationally deliberate in one day and decide what to do. He did what he had the habit of doing. And I think that's true. We're not going to just I love these philosophical, we didn't do a lot of trolley problems. Trolley problems, like, you know what a trolley is, right? Like, we don't use that word a lot anymore, but it's like the light rail downtown, like a light train. So trolley problems are like, you're up on a platform, you see a trolley headed towards 5 people that are tied up on the tracks, but if you pull a lever, it goes down a different track and there's only 1 person tied up over there. So like, do you pull the lever to kill the 1 to save the 5? And they seem like crazy, because like, when would you ever be in that situation, right? I mean, I like them because I think it still pulls out what makes it right or wrong, right? Active, passive, you know. But the thing about virtue is it's more grounded in reality. Like, if we know what I really have to do is be kind to the people in my church that I disagree with and, you know, bless my neighbors, the way I'm going to do that is by building virtues through habits, right?
I've got a quick question. Whenever we're in the process of doing that, aren't we as well as learning as well? That's a learning process as well, because I've experienced that personally, exactly what you just described. And not only have I been able to do that and respectfully respect that boundary, so to say, but I have learned so much in that process. And I'm 38 years old today. I mean, in this year, and knowing that today, like, I didn't know about that. So in that process that you just described, I actually learned something by being kind to those people that you really don't want to be kind to. And I mean, we can all relate on that, collectively speaking, because we all encounter that, you know? So I'm just being real on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jason, we talk about it often in our Bible study on Tuesday mornings, and when we come across different things that are challenges to us, that the more we practice doing what's right in the little things, when the big things come along, our natural tendency is much better towards sticking with what may be the hard but better choice, because we've built up this habit of practicing, whether it's taking time to read your Bible, or whether it's being kind to the person that annoys you, or, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just building up that within yourself, that becomes nature to you, and it kind of overcomes the nature of sinful man that's in us all.
And he who is faithful in the little things will be given greater things.
I was thinking the same thing on the line with Glenda, that when it comes to making choices and doing what's right, that Jesus was God, but he learned obedience through the things he suffered. So he had to learn these things. And so, like Glenda, it's incorporated. Once you practice those things, you know, maybe we didn't suffer what he did, but you do suffer some. But he had to learn and suffer while he was learning these things.
That's good. That's really good.
One thing I was going to ask is, do you see any differences in Aristotle's virtues and Christian virtues? So we didn't go through all these. These use a lot of old language, but courage, temperance, prudence, magnanimity, good temper, authenticity, friendliness, and modesty are some of the main ones. I deleted a couple rows here and tried to simplify some of the language, but those are some of the main ones. Justice isn't on here, but he would usually put justice as a key. I didn't know what the deficit and excess was, but prudence, courage, temperance, and justice were kind of like the big four, I think. But what else? I mean, if you were going to think through Christian virtues, would you add, change?
When I was doing the fruits of the Spirit one, I think it was gentleness was one that was left out of Aristotle, and it was interesting to kind of study what they thought about gentleness in the Greek and Roman culture, and then that Jesus said gentleness is a virtue, gentleness is strength.
I've got something that just come to my mind is genuineness, because when I first came here, I'm new to the region. I'm from Wichita Falls, so we're here for a little while. But coming into Bamel, it's very genuine. It was a genuine encounter. This will be my second or third Sunday. So with that genuineness as a Christian on that side, it was very inviting. So I think that's something that comes to my mind is genuine, because it's attractive to those that are not only new, but even to people that don't believe in Jesus. Because sometimes I'm going to be honest with you, we're the only Jesus some people will ever see, you know, and I've experienced that personally. So I know that we're always going to be imitators of Jesus to the best of our ability. So I want to express that I'm very grateful for Bill for inviting me to this class, because I'm actually getting a lot out of it. Thank you, Mr. Bill.
Well, that's nice. All right, good.
Yeah.
Love, I think, is something, you
Love.
would think the
Yeah.
Greek words with their, at least 4 different definitions, they would see that, but they use more Paul and Jesus presenting a different.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a lot. Faith, hope, and love, kind of the big 3 in Christianity. So faith, hope, and love, humility, forgiveness. And I think it's interesting because, Garrett, correct me on my Latin if I'm wrong here, but the Latin word for man is, I would say vir, but you would maybe say weir with the pronunciation, right? But V-I-R.
Yeah.
My understanding of the etymology is virtue and virile come from the same root. And what the Greek and Roman virtue philosophers often focused on, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in here, but the most important things tended to be what made a strong man a good citizen. If you're going to be a citizen of Athens and you're going to defend our way of life, like what makes you a pillar of our community? And that can be great, but it didn't tend to focus on humility, forgiveness, love and meekness. And that's a big deal because that's actually what made Nietzsche hate Christianity. Nietzsche thought that Christianity is a religion of women and children and slaves, and it's made Europe weak. And he wanted to go back to the pagan virtues. I mean, that was his big thing, was we need strong virtues to pull us into the future because Christianity is making us weak. Now, I don't believe that it actually does make us weak. I think it can be harder to do the things Christ calls us to do than not. I think it takes a lot of strength to be Christ-like. But if we use the phrases like the upside-down kingdom or whatever, right? I mean, the vision of the good world that God and Christ present to us is different than the vision of the world that others envision. And, Paul says that it's foolishness to the world, but I'm going to quote it wrong. It's the salvation to those of us that believe, right? So, yeah.
But I'm interested is Aristotle came up with this philosophy, I guess, 300 or so years before Christ even came to the earth. And then how do you, one thing with virtues is how do you, let me back up a little bit. I think we all agree that those are ideal situations. If we could all live by those, what a great place the world would be. But how do you make laws around those things? Or do you need to make laws around those things? And I think, it's kind of going down the list, but I think all of those can be sort of summed up in the quote that Jesus made of do to others as you would have them do to you. I think they apply to each one of those.
Yeah, that's good. And I don't know if this is exactly where you were going, but it reminded me of something I wanted to say, and we've only got like 4 minutes left, so we'll see if this makes sense to y'all or not. I've treated deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue as like 3 mutually exclusive different branches. And we've kind of asked the same questions of all of them, which is like, what's the right thing to do? How do I decide? Do I lie to the Nazi when he asks me about the Jews in my attic? But ethics actually has multiple questions. Like, one is, what's the right thing to do? How do I decide what the right thing to do is? But I think a slightly different question, this may sound the same, is why? Like, why is it the right thing to do? And then a third question is, but how do I actually do it? Like, how do I become the person that will do that? And I kind of feel like the 3 different ones are better at 3 different questions. Deontology, which is the rules, is pretty good at what's the right thing to do. And most Christians are pretty comfortable with it because the Bible does give us a lot of rules, right? It says, do this, don't do that. And to your point about how do we make laws about virtues, it's hard to legislate this. We can legislate deontology, right? And it's pretty good at like don't kill the patient, right? First, do no harm. It's good. But why? And that's where like I don't completely buy into utilitarianism, but it's giving a glimpse of something about the why, right? Doing flourishing and not pain, suffering, right? That there's something about the why that's in that. But how? Like, how do I actually do that? I think virtue is hands down the most helpful. You can't legislate courage and temperance, but if I want to do good in the world, I got to practice these, and faith, hope, love, humility, gentleness, kindness. It doesn't matter how many trolley exercises I think about. I'm not going to be kind to my uncle that voted differently than me at Thanksgiving unless I've worked real hard at practicing the virtues, right? And so I think the how is, so I don't know if that integrates the three at all or not. I think their strength comes out in different angles of ethics, right? And I think the reason we need virtue the most is God wants us to actually do this stuff. And I think this is how we do more of it, is we practice the virtues and we try to develop a Christ-like character. I probably got to let you go. It's almost 10 o'clock. We got one more week. I actually don't know for sure what we're going to do next week because we left 2 weeks for ethics. And we could continue it, but we've covered a lot of the foundation, and Garrett's got some ideas on what he wants to cover. So we're going to brainstorm this week and see what we develop. So I hope you're here for our last week. It'll be fun. Thanks for being here. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.